for the sale aspect in ShipMD, will ShipMD go beyond helping the entity by influencing policy and by streamlining the processes for device development, I presume?
Actually, sure, I'm the right person to answer this, but my understanding is that ShipMD in itself, it will not be a lobbying or a policy-setting group. It will work closely with regulatory bodies, specifically the FDA, and there is some interplay with that. But to my understanding, other panelists, please correct me if I'm wrong, that is not part of ShipMD's role.
So this is Tara Federici, and maybe I'll just jump in. There is, and you'll hear this in some of the other presentations today, reimbursement and regulatory, there is a desire to have short, intermediate, and long-term goals associated with ShipMD. And some of those longer-term goals will impact, if we achieve them, the policy. And some of them will require legislation. So while John is correct, ShipMD itself will not be a lobbying entity. It's our hope that the coalition of stakeholders that's been created around this particular initiative will help in advocating the need for some of these longer-term policy changes on Capitol Hill.
I could jump in. Sorry, Kawalji. One of the questions I saw that came up, and I think it's a very, very important question in the chat, and I think relates to what SHIP's role is and what SHIP's role isn't. We just talked about what it isn't, which is it is not a lobbying entity. Nevertheless, it can provide information and data for informing new policies and new statutes. The other question relates to intellectual property. What is SHIP's role with regard to intellectual property? SHIP is not property. The inventor owns the intellectual property, and the inventor pursues, whether that inventor is an individual, a startup company, or even a large company that's looking to utilize the services of SHIP. I think that's very, very important to emphasize that as far as what SHIP's role is.
I'll just chime in on that. This gets back to the point around ShipMD being using a fee-for-service model. It is not envisioned that ShipMD would get IP, nor would they get equity or have any other kind of financial stake in the innovation or the startup company. Certainly, if the innovation is brought by a larger player, that just wouldn't make sense. We have very much thought about this as something that is independent from equity, IP, or other long-term obligations of the innovator to ShipMD.
Thank you. Okay, so there is another question again by Gary Dulac. What is the maturity threshold for ShipMD entry? POC, in vivo, or any other stage for the device you feel is going to be the most appropriate? Do you think Tara, would you like to answer the question, or Vasum?
Sure. It looks like John's maybe having some technical issues, but yeah, if I'm understanding the question correctly, the points I think that John laid out at the very beginning in terms of what qualifies a company to best benefit from the SHIP ecosystem and the SHIP system of hospitals and the evidence generation networks, that really is what we want to begin to consider, right? What is that qualification standard? What are the success metrics? and at what stage in your development process would coming into the ship process be of most value to a company. So as John mentioned, there are going to be some very fundamental minimum requirements, and he went through some of those very clearly. But when a company is ready to engage with the FDA, ready to engage with the evidence generation process, that's probably the time at which they will benefit most from the foundation that we're trying to set up with the SHIP ecosystem.
Anyone else in the panel has any thoughts about this question?
No, but I think, this is Pedro, I think it relates to one of the other questions I saw in the chat, which is, is it possible for an inventor to actually enter only a certain component in SHIP? Because many of these technologies are already involved with incubators and other entities that are part of the ecosystem. And I think as John, I think pointed this out, that is the goal. The goal is that it's not a one size fits all. There are components of SHIP that may benefit certain technologies. Yes, there are developments or innovations that can benefit from the entire navigation process, but that's not necessarily going to be the case for all of them. And I think it's important to recognize that there are components of SHIP that may be of value to some and not to others.
Yeah, I'd like to elaborate on that point. I think that's a really important point, Pedro. This market is so challenging, and it's challenging even for companies with tremendous resources. And so if you're a large company, ShipMD could provide tremendous resources to that large company by having this ready-made network of clinical trial sites. So it's really intended that a la carte option is going to be important to really facilitate and encourage innovation throughout the spectrum of company sizes.
Yep.
Reflected on the panel just here, I think we all recognize that no one stakeholder can make this work. That's why we've all come together and why we think this collaborative effort, including the regulators, folks from industry, from investigators, everybody is going to play a role, and we're much better. The sum of the parts is better than any individual part alone, and I think that's the thing that we all want to emphasize, that we've recognized that this hasn't worked. What we've done so far has not worked, and it hasn't helped our kids, and there's lots of opportunities to do that, and we need the help. We need these devices for our kids if we want to improve these outcomes. And so we're all very passionate about this, and after really years of contemplation and coming up, I thought this presentation by Pedro and John was exceptional at putting sort of the entire framework together for everyone so that people would have a general understanding how this will work.
Continuing on this same theme that we've been discussing about the device eligibility or company eligibility, another question from Kenneth Gao. Is ShipMD designed only for those who have an idea, or does it require a prototype only? Also, what are the financial considerations in terms of who owns patents? So basically, I think what Kenneth is trying to get to is that how early in the process, for the innovator, they can actually try to get and access ShipMD services. Some of that question has already been answered by Versum, but I think what he's getting to is that if someone is very early in the process and still get in the conceptual phase for developing a device, are ShipMD services available at that time or no?
Yeah, and John, I'm going to hand this back to you in a second, but I think, Kanwaljit, this topic really gets at what John and Pedro have outlined already. Again, what are those minimum requirements? They're, at the point at which a innovator has, I talk about an idea on a napkin, right? There are so many other players and support services available in the ecosystem. Consultation services, the pediatric device consortia programs are a great resource for those for innovators at that level as well. And we can certainly get into a little bit of those details. But the key point is SHIP is not intended to duplicate services that are already functioning well within the ecosystem. SHIP is really intended to bring together and create a national system that integrates a number of very key factors that hopefully will mitigate, streamline the hurdles, mitigate the hurdles, make it make sense for innovators to enter the market, sustain in the market, innovate in the market. So, that's really what we're getting at. And just to be very clear about that initial point, when you're at the level of, you've got an idea on a napkin, it's a fantastic idea. Plenty of resources out there. From an FDA standpoint, please reach out to the Pediatric Device Consortia programs. Those programs can provide you with a great deal of assistance to help develop that idea, understand the regulatory process, think about business, clinical, other aspects, and perhaps get you ready to be able to enter and qualify for the SHIP program and be successful in the SHIP program.
One of the other questions that I saw, I think is very similar along those lines, is what kind of evidence is SHIP generating? Is it purely clinical trials? I think there's a broader goal to SHIP. And it is to generate evidence, but it doesn't necessarily have to be only through a clinical trial. Real-world evidence is one example. But even early on, evidence that you might need for approaching a regulatory agency for a particular type of evaluation, whether it doesn't have to be necessarily clinical. The other question related to that was, does it have to be a particular device? In other words, some artificial intelligence algorithms are regulated by the devices branch. I think in what we tried to say is that SHIP is somewhat agnostic in the sense of it could be a class 1, a class 2 usually, if you're going to need some clinical data, a class 2 device or a class 3 device. There has to be a need for data generation, evidence generation, in order to advance through the regulatory process. That's where the sweet spot, I think, is for SHIP.
Yeah, I was just going to add in on that a little bit, because I think we had some very interesting conversations around some of these issues early on. And it led us to favor terms like evidence generation over clinical trial. There are multiple ways to generate evidence. There are multiple needs. We also came back to this idea. This is a system of hospitals. We are talking about what needs to be done within a children's hospital. If things need to be done in other ecosystems, other places, that's fine. That's probably not for this program. This is very specifically designed to help with that interaction with multiple children's hospitals to accelerate pediatric devices. And we'll use that broadly. That may be software, maybe an algorithm, there may be other things in there that will benefit from being involved with that ecosystem. But we are not going to, I would not expect that SHIP-MD will go beyond that into anything to do with anything being developed in the pediatric space. This is the sweet spot. And I think it's really important to iterating that.
So I just want to add a little bit of clarification there. And the hospital Workstream, which John Davis participates on, will outline this very well. I think we envision children's hospitals being at the core, but we're really talking about a hub and spoke network. Because some of the very important devices that children need are developed in other centers of excellence within our country that aren't necessarily children's hospitals. So just a slight clarification to what you just said, John. Thanks.
Thank you. That's absolutely fair. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara.
Also, I think there are devices that could be tested in the ambulatory setting. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the inpatient setting, all of which is within the scope of what a hospital does provide. But I think particularly for children, devices that are, the ear infection diagnostic device is meant to be tested in an ambulatory setting rather than an in-hospital setting.
Yeah, Vasam, go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, while you're teeing up the next question, Kanwaji, just to kind of add a little bit more context to the conversation, one of the foundational tenets here of the ShipMD system is to create a national ecosystem where there is the safest possible environment to be able to evaluate these novel technologies, right? And we want to ensure that that innovation aspect of developing new technologies occurs in environments that have the appropriate breadth and depth of infrastructure, expertise, and experience to be able to engage the process in a safe manner.
Hospital criteria Workstream are, I think, pondering over this question at great length in terms of what are the qualifying criteria for the hospitals. There's actually a really interesting question about eligibility for devices in case in a condition, situation where there are multiple applicants for a similarly innovative device. So the question is from Jacqueline Phillips, and it reads, how will the eligibility to board SHIP be determined such that SHIP is not picking winners and losers? Will there be a priority scoring system? For example, if there are two equally innovative applicants with a novel ASD closure device, what are we going to do in that case?
I'll start with that one just to go back. And Jackie, that's an excellent question, and one that really deserves some very serious thought. So as I talked about, I think there is a minimum standard for whether an innovation is just eligible. It's qualified to get into ShipMD. It has to have the right fit. If there is demand that is in excess of capacity of the system, and ShipMD has to start making tough decisions about who is in and who is not, this is one of these things. It has to be thought out very carefully for some of these reasons that you have raised. ShipMD probably should not be in the business of picking winners and losers. But this is a discussion point. Are there metrics or things that we look at that does prioritize things one over another? If there are competitive things, probably don't want to have that be creating, picking one over another. There has to be some fairly clear and objective measures by which we can pick them. Is it going to be around unmet need? Is it going to be around what SHIP can offer? Are they going to get the most out of the system? Is it going to be, are they actually going to be able to raise enough money to pay for the services? These are questions that still have to be answered. And I'm not pretending we know what that is right now, but this is one of the big tasks we have in front of us. I suspect some of my colleagues here will have some further thoughts on that and maybe be able to bring more clarity to it. But this is a really important thing.
Eiling, Vasam, do you have any ideas about this? Sorry, I think you're on mute, Vasam. You're on mute.
Belabor John's point, I think you outlined it perfectly, but I just want to point out that if we're at the point with SHIP where we're having to potentially turn people away because we've got too many applicants, then that is success. That is a ecosystem that is evolving towards the point of actually developing the technologies that are necessary for children. As John mentioned, we certainly don't want to be in the business of turning anyone away or creating undue or inappropriate advantage to one over the other. But it really is a wonderful perspective to be thinking about the option where we have more applicants than capacity.
And it could well be that, we've envisioned a coordinating center of some type for SHIP who will be able to work with the sponsors over these kinds of questions. It may be that if a particular device for ASD closure is already being used in SHIP-MD, that we set it up almost like a platform trial. That, the next device person or sponsor who's interested in this ASD repair space gets their protocol ready, works on everything, gets all their IRB approvals, and everything is all set so that as soon as that first device is done, the next one just slips in and starts immediately. And that's the concept that we're using for alternative study designs with platform trials. We have that going on with diabetes drugs. We have like 6 of them that we're interested in studying, and we're going one at a time. So I think there will be options. There'll be conflict of interest committees in case, for instance, one of the hospitals or investigator is working on a particular device that may be in conflict with another device. So I think we've thought of all these things. They're really good questions. And I think once this process starts to move forward, then those kinds of specifics and details can really be addressed. And we're hoping that many of you in the audience and asking these questions will participate in that thought process and help develop this. This is sort of an evolving mechanism, and it's alive. And there's lots of opportunities to shape this, and that's why we're holding this meeting now, is to get as much feedback from as many as the key stakeholders, because we really want this to be successful. We need this to be successful.
Yeah, and John, I just want to add to that as well. And we didn't even discuss, this topic specifically right before the session. But as you alluded to with respect to adaptive trials for drugs and pediatric drugs, we're already working with one of our centers of excellence in regulatory science and innovation, the CERCs, as some people might know them as. Specifically, this one is with the Stanford team. And my team and their team are looking at how we can develop adaptive platform trials for pediatric devices, especially in a multi-center network like SHIP. So that could help with these points that are being brought up.
Yes, thanks, Vassam. Thanks, John. Yeah, that's a great idea. Adaptive design is something we should certainly consider as we go on developing the strategic plan. There's a question from Anna Mary, and basically that question reads, can innovators be admitted into SHIP if they only need certain pieces of the SHIP and the journey? She also says that many small innovators are already in or have been incubators or accelerators to help develop and accelerate their tech. So what happens if they only need like certain, like an a la carte menu type of a situation, right? They only need a certain pieces of advice, for example. Is this something that is possible within the SHIP-MD framework? Are we considering that? John, do you have any thoughts about that?
John May?
Sorry, I should be clarifying. John Padre, yeah.
So yes, the short answer is yes. I think that part of the thinking around this is that the system, it's not one size fits all. It will be able to take applicants in, enroll innovations that have different needs, which may be for a much smaller part of that timeline, thinking about those case studies. If the innovation is coming into SHIP just to say, get some strategic advice, that would seem to not be a great fit. But if the innovation is looking to tap into some of the core services, then it could come in for just one small part of it. I think that is very much the vision. Exactly how that plays out, still figuring that out. But it is not you have to come in at just point A and you exit at point B. There's a lot of variability in there.
I should stress that we've set this up as a service organization. similar to what the Clinical Translational Science Award program has been set up from NIH. And I think we want to be as flexible as possible, as inclusive as possible, and as responsive as possible to the sponsors, whether that's a company, whether it's an investigator, a university, a hospital, etc., bringing devices into this ecosystem. So I think anyone can certainly reach out to the members of the coordinating committee and say, is this a good fit? Here's what we're thinking, and get that kind of feedback and input as to whether it's an appropriate time and device for the consortium to consider.
And another question from Animesh Tandon, and that question is, will ChipMD try to see if existing technologies could benefit kids, but inventors don't know about it? For example, basically the question is that, will ChipMD solicit applications?
Maybe I could jump in here, while others are collecting their thoughts. So the simple answer here, I think, again, to kind of provide that broader context and vision here for SHIP, we want SHIP to be something that any innovator with a fantastic idea and that is ready at the stage of qualification that John and Pedro outlined, those minimum requirements, can tap into, right? So it's going to be able to really advance the point from readiness to working through the evidence generation, regulatory, potentially reimbursement, and then getting to market. The fundamental point there with focusing on benefits that truly can make a difference in the lives of children, right? So any type of technology that meets the qualification standards, that can obviously benefit from the SHIP system that's been set up, can get there. Again, I'm going to point out, we're not looking to duplicate services that may already be available, especially in that early or very early development period for ideas and technology. We want to be able to support those technologies that are ready for qualification, that really can make a public health impact for pediatric services.
I think it's.
So I would just jump in here. This question emphasizes the point that this public-private independent entity, ShipMD, is intended to be a voluntary process. It's not mandatory. But the questioner makes a good point. There may be products on the market currently that may be beneficial to children. And if people become aware that there's a mechanism now, an ecosystem to really facilitate and de-risk the entire development process vis-a-vis pediatrics, then I think we may see more interest in expanding indications for pediatrics.
Right. Thanks, Tara.
Kanwaljit, may I add something quickly as well?
Yes.
So, I think it's important to keep in mind as well that the ShipMD process and the scope that people have heard about today, and I appreciate the speakers for their very detailed and eloquent descriptions of this process. That this what's been shared today is still reflects germinal ideas that can be reflected upon and I'm sure improved upon in some areas. One thing that the participants can do is offer their ideas. So there have been many eyes that have looked at this ecosystem from a number of different directions, but the 200 eyes of the 100 participants in this work stream today will be valued input. So please send us comments in the comment section or otherwise communicate with us and share your reflections, because we haven't thought of everything, and your ideas are all good ones.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Rosenthal. I've already emphasized it multiple times. We do want to solicit your feedback and input. So, every piece of feedback that we get, we will try our best to actually incorporate that into the strategic plan that we are developing. So we greatly appreciate your help in refining this as we work on this after the meeting. Thank you. Another question from Jacqueline Phillips, and that question reads, will success be determined differently by each stakeholder? It is also important to eliminate barriers for innovators. So basically she asks, will the innovator be able to disembark at any port or any point, for example? For example, will they be able to disembark after capital raise or early acquisition, or when after they run out of money? So what are the exit stages, and is an innovator exit at any point they want to?
So I think the vision is, we've talked a little bit about how innovations can enter at different stages. I think the vision is that applies to exit as well. If an innovator has used the services they need, and there's no more to get there, and they don't want to stay in, it'd be done. We still want to be able to measure the success there. There has to be some process in place, so for the benefit of the entire community, we can say, hey, yes, this was a successful, I'll use the term, graduation. There may be situations where it is not successful, and we need to be able to accommodate that as well. Failure will, if everything succeeds, then maybe it doesn't have the validity that we would hope it would have. So we do need to have mechanisms that identify failure as well. We don't need to necessarily shout and scream about failures, but we do need to recognize them. This is an important part of the process in order to share successes, to make the program valuable for all of the stakeholders, because there are different needs that so many of the different stakeholders have here, and they'll see successes in different ways, and each innovation will have their own metrics of success. So as I said earlier, we need to accommodate a lot of different lenses here, and just to wrap up your point around making sure, I think that we're inclusive with a lot of groups. I think that is an important thing, a really important thing to have as a priority when we're talking about selection, and not just selection, but sort of encouraging innovators with pediatric solutions to come to this group, because as a public-private partnership, that should be a big part of our role. We want to help devices that might not otherwise survive, that can have real impact on children. We want to help them get to market. So these are really important points, and I hope at the next stage we start to get some real meat on the bones around those things.
I would think that success is measured differently by different people. And so if a sponsor comes to SHIP and quickly gets their contract signed, gets their IRB approval, gets the centers up and running, and gets their patients enrolled in a streamlined fashion that saves them time and money, and even if the device doesn't work, not everyone will, or it may not have the same impact that people were anticipating. Some people may consider that a failure. I would consider that a success. Not every drug and device that's studied has actually worked. And yet, if you can do the trial safely and move it through the process quickly, to me, that's a successful venture.
And just to add a little bit to that as well, John, I think John Parker went through this a little bit earlier, but when we qualify the applicants coming into SHIP, we want to make sure that they're ready for success, right? So if the attrition rate is not high, we want to be able to mitigate that attrition rate. We want to make sure that the company, the device, and all aspects to be able to navigate through the SHIP system, that they're ready. And we want to be able to support that and ensure that they can move through the SHIP ecosystem to the level of success that they feel is appropriate. But that also probably needs to be thought through at some point on that front end. Right, so this isn't going to just be a midway, it's kind of, we'll go with the nautical themes here, right? You're not going to start sailing and not have a compass at some point, and if your compass doesn't work, then you're kind of out of luck. So we want to be ready. You want to have the compass, make sure it's working, plenty of supplies, all the no holes in the ship to make sure that it's kind of going through and ready to get to where it needs to go.
I think, Walji, the final thing I'd emphasize is there's short-term success and longer-term success. And I think one of the things that SHIP can help with interactions with regulatory authorities and others, it's very unique in children. How far do you need to follow them to know that a device that's placed is working and it's doing what it needs to do? And so we really debate at great length on the drug side, well, how long do you need to follow these children out if it's being done in the newborn intensive care unit or in a young child to know that it's making a significant impact? So I think it's important for the sponsors. It'll be short-term benefits where, yep, you've closed that ASD. It may be longer-term tracking. Does the ASD stay closed? And what impact does that have? Eliminating a surgery, eliminating anesthesia for the child. I mean, these are really big deals. So I think that's going to be a very, very important aspect of what SHIP adds that will be very hard for any sponsor to do this on their own.
And just to add a little bit on the flip side of that, if a device is not going to work, if you're going to, the old adage, if you're going to fail early. The advantage of that to everyone involved is, number one, less children will be exposed to a device that's not going to work. Number one. Number two, you'll save time and money for the individuals who are sponsoring the device as well as those who are investing in the device. So I think I would absolutely agree with you, John, that it failed just because the device doesn't do what it was originally intended to do. That could be a win, and it could be a win for all stakeholders if, in fact, it answers that question in a definitive way.
Thank you, Pedro.
To jump in here and add, and Pedro, I think you touched on this, or John Parker, or one of you did, and that is, one of the elements that SHIP-MD can provide is the ability to collect real-world evidence. And that goes to the point that John Davis just made, which is, for some of these products, you may need longer-term follow-up. And real-world evidence can be an important mechanism for that. It could also be an important mechanism for expanding indications or labeling for products that are already on the market.
So there's a question from Beverly. The reason I've displayed the timeline here is because there's a timeline question, and she's asking, when you look at the enhanced development timeline with SHIP-MD, besides shortening the hospital contracting process, where else do you see the SHIP-MD having the most impact in streamlining the process?
Start with addressing that question, because I think it gets at the question of value. What value is SHIP adding? If you run a pediatric, let's talk about a clinical trial. If you run a clinical trial, aside from the administrative components, patient enrollment, identifying the right candidate patients and enrolling them is a hugely complex and time-consuming process. Just identifying the eligible patients, because we're talking mostly about uncommon problems, uncommon diseases. Even in the examples here, where it's a pediatric heart valve, there's not that many of those procedures that are done in the U.S. or in North America. And so having this network of hospitals, you're much more likely to be able to identify those hospitals that have that kind of patient population that they treat. And this could also be true for a diabetes intervention. It's even more common problem. So I think that's the other value that it adds. And then there are other components. Some groups may come in with a great deal of knowledge and understanding of the regulatory process. They may not need that, but I would venture to guess that many others will. They've had no experience and they've been working in a hospital setting and really have never had exposure to the whole concept of regulatory approval or even the commercialization process. So I think you can look at different aspects of SHIP, and that's the beauty of it. I think is that it will adapt to the needs of the particular sponsor.
So, Tara, I just want to follow up on that. I mean, one of the things that SHIP will do, and you'll see this in the regulatory workstream session, it's going to create connections with FDA. So each review division will have an FDA, a liaison with SHIP-MD. That's going to facilitate the ability of that review division to get access to clinical expertise and insights that they may not currently have visibility to. That will inform the benefit risk analysis that the reviewers have to do, and that of course drives the evidence requirements. So that is an important aspect of SHIP-MD, is this connection with FDA and facilitating that interaction and providing access to clinical expertise so that you're getting a real world visibility into what the current situation is for a particular condition or device or treatment.
Thank you, Tara. I think Vasam had some comments about that, right? Vasam, you're on mute.
Somehow, getting muted regularly. I just wanted to add a little bit to Pedro's first point as well. Tara certainly had an important point there as well, but just to kind of make it very simple. I think Pedro did this in a very eloquent way. I'm just going to keep it very easy here just for the sake of conversation and to drive home these key points. With respect to these small, heterogeneous, geographically dispersed populations that we talk about in pediatrics, the challenges in collecting the evidence, having access to those patients, enrolling those patients. Well, that's a foundational tenet of the SHIP ecosystem as we've developed it. For instance, if you wanted to access those patients and you're able to engage with one hospital, maybe a pediatric hospital that specifically takes care of those patients, that's going to take quite a bit of time to get the relationships, the contracts, everything set up. Well, with SHIP, just for the sake of the conversation here, let's say they've already qualified, 5, 10 or more of those centers that, in Pedro's example, does congenital cardiac surgery. There aren't many of those. So if you now have access to, 5 or 10 of those hospitals and let's say you need 100 patients, if you only had one hospital, well, that would take quite a little bit of time to maybe collect those 100 patients or those 100 cases, especially in specific aspects of congenital cardiac surgery. Now, with the 10, perhaps you've reduced that time period quite a bit. Let's assume that initially with the one hospital for the 100 patients, it would take, 5 years. Maybe with the 10 hospitals, with a few patients at each hospital, it might take a year or two. And that's a significant reduction in the efforts to be able to generate the evidence. Actually getting high quality evidence is improved, and very simply, reducing that time makes a big difference for many innovators in having success in the market. And that success in the market translates fundamentally into success for patients and their families and the people that are taking care of them. So that's in a very simple manner, this is what we are attempting to create with the SHIP-MD system.
Thank you, Basum. So this is time check. We have 2 minutes left into the session, so most likely I'll have a time to ask just one more question from the panelists, but I reassure everyone that all of the questions that we did not touch today, we will be reaching out to you individually and get the answers to the questions. Plus, obviously some of the feedback that is going to be gotten from answering those questions will be incorporated into a strategic plan. So the last question that I'll get to is from Declan. And that question is, can the panel comment on how clinical trial data collection and oversight will work? Is it envisaged that the ShipMD network will utilize a common database, for example, third party and an oversight committee, or is that up to the sponsor? So perhaps someone in the clinical realm of the thing might be able to get to this. John Davis, do you have any thoughts about this? Or if anyone else in the panel feels they're, they have some interesting answer to this question, please feel free to speak up. Vasum, I think
yeah, John, when you're ready, speak in. But very simply put, we want to create a standardized, unified data management system amongst all the entities that will be part of the ShipMD's framework. That is certainly going to help with many of the challenges, kind of just in that very intimate thing of being able to both generate the evidence, get the data, clarify the data, have it ready for presentation to regulatory authorities, all of that. So these are developmental aspects that will take place down the line. And if we can get to the point where there are standardized processes, that is going to make a significant difference, both in time and cost to innovators and to the hospital systems, and fundamentally, again, towards getting those devices out to children.
Any final thoughts from the panelists about this particular question? Okay, if none, I would like to thank each and every one of you, including the audience, including the presenters and the panelists, for being here with us today.